And so what you have is you have compliance and security regulations happening within the industry coming from one end, and then you have regulation coming from the government from the other end. And so you find folks in a bit of a scramble to solve for not just payments information, but also for privacy regulations.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, the CyberWire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host, Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
On today's show, Ben looks at the recent Russian takedown of alleged REvil masterminds. I look at warrantless requests for WhatsApp metadata. And later in the show, my conversation with Rustin Miles from Bluefin. We're discussing compliance regulation as it relates to the payment security space. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. And now a few thoughts from our sponsors at KnowBe4. What do you do with risk? We hear that you can basically do three things. You can accept it, you can transfer it, or you can reduce it. And of course, you might wind up doing some mix of the three. But consider this. Risk comes in many forms, and it comes from many places, including places you don't necessarily control. Many an organization has been clobbered by something they wish they'd seen coming. So what can you do to see it coming? Later in the show, we'll hear some of KnowBe4's ideas on seeing into third-party risk. All right, Ben, we got some good stories to share this week, but before we do, we have a little bit of follow-up from a listener named Casey who wrote in and said, regarding the Caveat Podcast 108, two things. First, when considering whether to make constitutional amendments easier, we should always first consider how easy we would want it to be for our political opponents, those who see things oppositely than we do, to change the Constitution. I would agree with that, Ben. I would say we're kind of in the midst of that. We're in the heat of that right now with the filibuster debate, right?
Yeah, I'm cynical enough to believe that most people don't have really firm principles when it comes to procedural things, like how easy it should be to pass a constitutional amendment or whether there should be a filibuster, that for most people it's situational. I think there are people who have spent a lot of time thinking about both of these issues, the filibuster and constitutional amendments. And in the long run, I think you can make a proper normative judgment as to whether it is too easy or too hard. I think it certainly has to be a much higher bar when we're talking about constitutional amendments than simply passing a law, because our Constitution is our sacred document. We should have to go through a bunch of hurdles in order to change it. And, I think the rationale of our founders is, we need to get the states involved. It was the states that, predated our federal Constitution. And so the state legislatures should have a say. And I certainly respect that. Anytime you're evaluating making these changes, you should always think about, what if it's the other guys? What if it's the people you most vehemently disagree with who make constitutional amendments? I still think even if you think about it like that, there is a case for arguing that the process should be not quite as cumbersome, given that we are a very closely divided country and getting 3/4 of our state legislatures to agree to anything is just kind of exceedingly difficult. But that is the process we have. It's not going to change anytime soon. So, but I think that listeners' note of caution is well-founded.
Okay. Well, Casey has another question. He says, how would Rule 407 of the Federal Rules of Evidence apply to post-cyber attack remedial efforts? Ah, yes, Rule 407. I know it well.
Oh, we all know that one. Yeah.
Actually, no, I don't know it well. Ben, what is it?
So it is a rule in the Federal Rules of Evidence, which are publicly available, by the way, online if you're ever extremely bored and want to check those out. Those rules are basically what information can and cannot be admitted in federal court. So they only apply to federal cases. Rule 407 is about evidence of somebody taking remedial measures in the aftermath of an alleged wrong, so an alleged tort or something like that. Basically, if you're being sued for negligence and, subsequent to that lawsuit, you take some type of remedial measure. Maybe you make your product a little safer. Maybe you streamline the distribution process. A court will not admit evidence of that to show that you were negligent in the first place, if that makes sense. Because they want to encourage people to take those remedial measures. So they don't want something like that to be admissible in court in order to prove that you were negligent in the first place. This question is about cyber incidents, and certainly Rule 407 applies. Let's say you're being sued because you were negligent, data was breached, something happened, and in response to the lawsuit itself, you take remedial measures, say by instituting multi-factor authentication. The fact that you took that action after being sued can't be admitted in evidence to show that you were negligent in the first place. It can be admitted for other reasons. So if there's any dispute about whether you had ownership of the software, it could be, the fact that you were the one who made changes to it. It can be admitted for those purposes. And it can be admitted, to impeach somebody's credibility. So, let's say you took remedial measures, but you had lied about whether you had taken those same measures in the past. You could introduce evidence to show that, the witness here is a liar.
I see.
But yeah, just like any other federal case, we want to encourage people to take remedial measures to correct past mistakes without worrying about whether it's going to hurt them in a lawsuit. So the rule certainly applies. Most state courts follow a version of the federal rules of evidence. There are some differences here and there, but it really is a template for most state cases as well. I think that this is an excellent question, a great point, and that federal rule of evidence does apply.
All right. Well, our thanks to our listener, Casey, for sending that in. We would love to hear from you. If you have a question for us, you can send it to caveat@thecyberwire.com. All right, Ben, let's jump into some stories here. Why don't you kick things off for us?
So my story comes from our friends at Motherboard by Vice, and it is entitled Russia Says It Has Arrested Members of the Notorious REvil ransomware gang. We talked about REvil last year. They were the alleged perpetrators of the Colonial Pipeline attack, or rather, they're associated with the alleged perpetrators of the Colonial Pipeline attack. That group is called DarkSide. So this is seemingly a really encouraging step. We had taken diplomatic measures over the past year as a country to try to encourage Russia to hold cyber criminals to account. And seemingly that's what they've done here. Their domestic law enforcement agency has made arrests of 14 members of this REvil group. Before we get, a little too rosy about what this means, there are some plausible explanations other than, Russia suddenly turned benevolent in the world of cyberspace. So, we could choose to believe that they've really decided based on, our diplomatic encouragement that they need to take ransomware attacks more seriously. And they're doing this out of the goodness of their own heart. It's, good for their international relations posture. That's possible. The more cynical explanation is they're looking to placate the West because they are currently engaged in activities, as we all know, around the Ukrainian border. And, so not only would they have incentive to show the West, like, we're not the lawless society that you're portraying us to be, but also, we're doing this for you now. But if we invade Ukraine or violate Ukraine's borders and you institute some sort of sanctions or other diplomatic pressure on us, maybe we won't be so nice to you about these, cyber criminals in the future.
Right.
This story has a little bit of international intrigue to it. We don't know the motivations behind the Russian government's decision here. I do think, regardless of the motivations, it's good news that, the alleged perpetrators of some of these very serious attacks are being brought to justice, have been arrested.
Yeah. I saw a cybersecurity ransomware expert, Alan Liska. He's from Recorded Future. He mentioned on Twitter he was sort of half jokingly wondered if this makes Russia's FSB eligible for the U.S. government's $10 million reward.
The prize grant, yeah.
Right, exactly.
I'm not sure how well that would sell politically. Yeah. This good old American group who checked all the boxes and helped us improve our own cybersecurity posture. Good for you, but we're going to give that $1 million to Russia, actually, Russian intelligence agencies.
Right. Yeah, or is it just professional courtesy? Yeah.
Yeah. Alan Liska was actually quoted in this piece, and he postulates, and I think this is certainly, something that we should keep in mind, that maybe ransomware groups aren't safe in Russia once they've outused their usefulness. That's the cynical view. I happen to think it's probably right. There are reasons for them to take law enforcement action post hoc, after there have been a series of attacks that have inflicted the type of damage that agents and the Russian government perhaps wanted to inflict on their foreign adversaries. And once that's done, as we mentioned, they might have their own reasons to hold those perpetrators accountable. But nevertheless, I mean, as he says in this article, they caused a lot of damage to many different types of organizations around the world. And having them face any consequences could serve as a disincentive for future cyber criminals. So whether or not, this is actually Russia getting serious about tackling ransomware, or, this is just a way to alleviate international pressure, the fact that they're being held to account is good news, and it's something that we should celebrate. I just think, you and I are almost always cynical, so it's not a problem for us. But if anybody was wearing rose-colored glasses and thinking, this was a major breakthrough in our international fight against ransomware, I'd think twice about that.
Yeah, we're all going to get together, hold hands, and sing "We Are the World."
Yeah, I mean, you never know. We certainly had visions of that in the 80s and 90s.
That's right.
But,
yeah,
I tend to think this is not the beginning of a future path that leads to us and our Russian and Chinese adversaries singing "We Are the World." Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
If I'm wrong, you can hold me accountable.
Well, I think we'll see if this is a one-off or if we continue to see more arrests from Russia's FSB or not. That'll be the proof in the pudding, I suppose.
Right. And the circumstances around these arrests. So what's going on geopolitically with Russia at the time? And, what other motivation might they have for holding these organizations accountable that might be below the surface? So that's they've outlived their usefulness. They're a sacrificial lamb. It's a misdirection. We always have to keep those people in mind, those theories in mind. But I mean, I think it's certainly worth keeping an eye on. I'm not going to completely discount the possibility that this is a good faith effort to hold cyber criminals accountable. And if it is, we should welcome it. So, I mean, we will be following this closely for sure.
Absolutely. All right, we will have a link to that in the show notes. My story this week comes from Forbes, written by Thomas Brewster, who we certainly feature here regularly. And the article is titled, "WhatsApp Ordered to Help U.S. Agents Spy on Chinese Phones, No Explanation Required." And this centers around some documents that were recently unsealed, and it has to do with surveillance from DEA investigators who demanded that Facebook track some users on WhatsApp, and they're making use of the Pen Register Act, which evidently goes back to 1986. Ben, can you give us a little Cliff's Notes on the Pen Register Act?
Yeah. Many of us were young or not yet born when the Pen Register Act was, at its most relevant stage. But basically, there used to be this device you would attach to a phone that would record the numbers being dialed and the duration of the calls back in the age of landline phones. Right. And the Pen Register Act of 1986 said that as long as it's part of a authorized criminal investigation, you do not need a warrant to install a pen register to obtain that type of metadata. So it doesn't collect any content. It's not a recording device. It's just information about the people involved in the communication. So the phone numbers, the accounts, et cetera.
And so when we transfer that to the modern age with apps like this, text messaging apps and so on, same sort of thing applies where they're just collecting who connected to whom, but not the actual content of the message.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about WhatsApp, they can't collect the content of the message because it's end-to-end encrypted. So the only useful information they could potentially glean from WhatsApp or any other provider, really, that has an end-to-end, encrypted messaging service is the metadata. Metadata might be extremely valuable when we're trying to, I think ends up being a case about the distribution of opioids. And if we can start to make connections as to who was communicating with whom, and then, we use human intelligence means to connect devices to individuals, phone numbers to individuals, account numbers to individuals. That's just good, intelligence work. And it's certainly permissible without a warrant as long as this isn't being done to harass people if it's part of a criminal investigation.
And it seems in this case, the DEA was trying to track down folks who were selling opioids and other drugs on the web, dark web markets and things like that.
Yeah, so things that clearly, the U.S. Justice Department would have a significant interest in. That's the purpose behind the Pen Register app in the first place, is getting a warrant when you're in the middle of a criminal investigation, when you don't have sufficient information to have probable cause to arrest somebody, would just be too cumbersome. And that's why we have this Pen Register Act. Its purpose is to, if you have an inkling that somebody is involved in criminal activity, if you can assert in front of a magistrate judge that the information likely to be obtained is relevant to an ongoing criminal investigation being undertaken by your agency, then law enforcement will be able to collect that information. That's unsettling to a lot of people because it means that the government has warrantless access to all of our metadata. And that's largely true, although there are starting to be some exceptions. And the constitutional reason for that is we just don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that metadata. So when it was phone numbers, and this comes from a famous 1979 Supreme Court case, Smith v. Maryland, the court held, we know that the phone company is making a record of all of the calls that we make for their own business purposes so that they can send us a bill at the end of the month. And because we know they're making those records, we don't have any expectation that those records won't be transmitted to law enforcement. It gets a little complicated when we're talking about end-to-end encrypted applications, just because, I don't think people are quite aware that the metadata itself might be logged and retained. It's the communications themselves that are encrypted, that are inaccessible to law enforcement. But I still think, from a constitutional perspective, people do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that sort of routing information. We don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy on what's on the outside of an envelope. We only have a reasonable expectation of privacy as to what's on the inside of an envelope. So I think from a constitutional perspective, it certainly makes sense, even though, the tone of this article, and I think maybe for a lot of our listeners, is that's a little screwed up, that you can obtain that information without getting a warrant.
So help me understand here. Do you still need to go in front of a judge to activate a pen register?
Yeah, you still have to go in front of a magistrate judge, but the standard is significantly lower than it is for any other type of surveillance
for a warrant.
Right, for a warrant, which you would need if you wanted to peruse the content of one's communications.
I see. I guess I'm wondering if the notion here is that part of the reason for having something like this is expediency. If I still have to stand in front of a judge, is that any faster than standing in front of a judge for a warrant?
I don't necessarily. I mean, I think you can establish expediency just through the process. And I think our Justice Department has a good process where they can get these applications in front of magistrate judges pretty quickly. I think the bigger impediment to them is getting past the standard. So having probable cause that somebody is committing or has committed a crime, when you're just at the early stages of an investigation is too high of a hurdle to climb for people who are involved in law enforcement. If you're, studying a drug smuggling operation, you might be at the very beginning stages, just trying to make connections of who the players are, who's selling, who's dealing, what the routes are. You can't obtain that information unless you do some type of surveillance. And to do that to do that preliminary surveillance, you're not going to have enough information to have a warrant. You're not going to have enough information to show that somebody has committed or is about to commit a crime. So in that sense, the fact that it's a lessened standard really does make it easier for law enforcement to do its job at the beginning of these investigations.
I see. All right. Well, we will have a link to that story in the show notes, so please do check that out. So let's return to our sponsor KnowBefore's question. How can you see risk coming, especially when that risk comes from third parties? After all, it's not your risk, until it is. Here's step 1. Know what those third parties are up to. KnowBefore has a full GRC platform that helps you do just that. It's called KCM, and its vendor risk management module gives you the insight into your suppliers that you need to be able to assess and manage the risks they might carry with them into your organization. With KnowBefore's KCM, you can vet, manage, and monitor your third-party vendors' security risk requirements. You'll not only be able to pre-qualify the risk, you'll be able to keep track of that risk as your business relationship evolves. KnowBefore's standard templates are easy to use, and they give you a consistent, equitable way of understanding risk across your entire supply chain. And as always, you'll get this in an effective automated platform that you'll see in a single pane of glass. You'll manage risk twice as fast at half the cost. Go to kb4.com/KCM and check out their innovative GRC platform. That's kb4.com/KCM. Request a demo and see how you can get audits done at half the cost in half the time. And we thank KnowBefore for sponsoring our show. Ben, I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Rustin Miles. He is from a company called Bluefin, and our conversation was about compliance regulation in the payment security space. Here's my conversation with Rustin Miles.
In the payments world, as you know, going back about 10 or 15 years, because the data, payment card data, is very easily monetized on the dark web by hackers, that particular industry had stood up early on to create its own self-regulation, if you will, compliance and security, namely the what came to be known eventually as the PCI Security Standards Council. And so we're doing that for quite some time, and lots of technologies, lots of disruptive entrants like my company and others coming into that space in order to bring security. What happened then is that the hackers really started looking at other ways to monetize data for personal health information and also personal identifiable information. And so they started looking at so these companies weren't just having to protect the payment card data, they needed to extend that. And then you had regulations over across the pond, GDPR, PSD2, and others in Europe that were dropping very hefty fines, millions and millions and millions of dollars of fines onto companies after a breach would happen if they had not followed, reasonable security standards. And then you have a CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, and then other states joining in, sort of doing the same thing here stateside in the United States. And so what you have is two things. You've got compliance and security regulations happening within the industry coming from one end, and then you have regulation coming from the government and passing out fines when you get it wrong from the other end. And so you find folks in a bit of a scramble to solve for not just payments information, but also for privacy regulations.
It's my perception, and please correct me if I'm mistaken here, that the U.S. has kind of lagged behind, say, Europe when it comes to the security of some of these payment options. They had, chip and PIN before we did. It seems like we've lagged with some of the I guess, the technology solutions. Is that an accurate assessment from your point of view?
So let me answer that with two parts. Number one, the actual chip and pin over there in Europe did not come as a innovation or there for payment security. It actually was an innovation that came out early on because of the lack of really good telecommunications and networking. So what happens is you might be out in the middle of nowhere with very poor telecommunications, and you needed to authenticate that card while it was going into the machine without being able to go off and do a real-time lookup at a bank. So what happens is the chip would have the PIN in it on the card, and it would say, hey, put your PIN in, and it was self-authenticate against the card there. So that technology was not put in place for security so much as it was the fact it didn't have real-time telecom. Now, eventually, as we know, as time moved on, it has other benefits because the magstripe read that we depended on both there and here really started to be something that was easily reproducible. So there was a built-in benefit that came in down the line with that. In the United States, we did not put in chip and pin, and we took a long time to get to chip as well. We could have had the same security by just doing magstripe read and pin. There really wasn't anything too great. Obviously, the chip has some advantages, but really where the biggest benefit is coming up when you talk about these kinds of technologies is the fact that there's two factors. There's the card you have in your hand and the PIN you know in your mind. So a lot of the benefit happening over there is the fact that there are two factors of authentication. Over here stateside, even now that we have chips, we still don't have that second factor of authentication being the PIN that's required. So that means lost or stolen chip cards. Someone can just pick up off the ground and go use it as if they would have used a swipe. So it really doesn't fix everything completely. Anything, even a magstripe read with a PIN would be more secure. In just the fact that, in basic security fundamentals, there's two factors of authentication going on there. But to answer your question more broadly, we have taken more time. We're a very much larger market. We actually have a much more penetration of cards. You look into some areas like Germany where there's only maybe 2 or let's just say under 10% penetration from Visa and MasterCard and some of these other brands. So we're heavily dependent on these card brands over here. And we're very wide and spread out, larger country, And so there has been some slow to adoption. And I'd say that one of the other things that folks don't think about is that it takes a lot of energy and effort for all of these software vendors, hardware providers, and sort of the long chains of value in technology that's been growing very quickly over the last 20 years to go in and say, hey, everyone, in order to accept cards, we demand or we mandate that you do this. In other smaller markets, and also where culturally mandates are traditionally more accepted of any kind, even just within the culture of the folks, you see in those markets that are smaller and are used to those kinds of things, where the governments have just come in and mandated it, would have been very difficult and probably slowed down the payments revolution here had we focused too much on a mandate. Obviously, there's a balance there, and probably ought to be looking a little bit of both, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, you mentioned culture. It still leaves me raising my eyebrows, when I go out to eat at a restaurant and when we wrap up the meal and I hand my credit card to a stranger who then walks away with it and takes it to another room, I still, sort of scratch my head and think, okay, we're still doing it this way. And, on the one hand, I suppose it's good that, the vast majority of time, nothing bad happens there. But the security side of me says, perhaps there's a better way to handle this.
Yeah, it's true. And it is certainly, when you step back from it, it can look a little silly. One of the things here in stateside in the United States is that we have a zero liability policy for the card holders, which means even if something should happen, they can charge it back, and the issuing bank or let's just say the issuing bank or the merchant's acquiring bank, they'll fight over who gets the liability. Over in Europe anymore, they are starting to push in certain cases this liability onto the consumer, where you have no chargeback rights. So I think if we start doing that here in the States, we'll see a strong consumer demand, let's just say, because we've taken away the zero liability rights for the consumers. But I have not heard much about anything heading in that direction for some time.
What about these next generation payment systems? I'm thinking of Apple Pay and Google Pay, and these systems that are using. I suppose, is it enhanced tokenization that would be an accurate way to describe what's going on there? Where do they fit into the overall ecosystem?
Yeah, great question, and it's really, I think, what is coming. We're going to see a lot of more and more news over the next year, even incentives coming from the card brands in order to adopt what's called issuer tokens or network tokenization. And so these wallets, the Google Pay Wallet, Android Pay Wallet, and other wallets like from the EMVCo's SCR, which we see MasterCard, Visa, and others rolling out, these do use issuer tokens. And really what's happened here is that we've seen, so my company, Bluefin, we were the first to provide point-to-point encryption, PCI validated or certified encryption, end-to-end encryption in the space. And what that really represented is a lot of merchants saying, hey, look, we don't want to be responsible for a breach. We don't want to be vulnerable or even have a compromise. Let's encrypt this stuff end to end. And so where you have a lot of enterprises doing that, and certainly it's been really great for our company, you have a lot of folks at the smaller end of the scale, these small businesses who don't have any appreciation for security, and they're not going to pay extra for encryption. Their biggest risk might be going out of business, rather than maybe having a breach, or at least as they perceive it. And so what happens is there's large parts of the market that simply aren't minding security, and so the brands have taken up pushing network tokenization, which basically replaces the card in the wallet with sort of a virtual number, right, or a token that then gets used, for that or a few transactions or as many transactions as they deem fit before they sort of change the underlying connection in the token. So that definitely you're going to see a lot. We're going to see incentives from the card brands, financial incentives and other, in order to push that, because I think spent a lot of time over the last decade trying to push security down into the small and medium and micro merchants. And you can only get so far before someone just expects it to be secure by nature. And so they're really, this is maybe say 2.0 of what a card number should be, are these new issuer tokens.
You mentioned that, PCI compliance was sort of self-imposed by the industry itself. Does that seem to be the path that we're on, that in terms of the payment industry's relationship with regulators, that there's more collaboration than an adversarial relationship? Or what do you expect to see as we go forward?
So the PCI Security Standards Council, of which I'm also on the board of advisors, and as it turns out, on the board of advisors, I actually represent a group called EPSM, European Payments and Service Providers for Merchants in Europe. So strangely enough, I'm actually a big working with the board of advisors. But the point I wanted to make there is that the SSC, Security Standards Council, is a global organization spanning Europe, Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, South, that basically the entire globe. And the executive committee members of that are the card brands: Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, JCB, and I think China Union Pay is involved now as well. So they are the executive members of that council. But what the idea there is to have participating organizations like Bluefin and thousands of others that are participating in the creation of those standards. But of course, the brands are involved as well, card brands, in order to help push and govern and make sure that we as an industry are representing every different industry and every different country and every different card type that participates. So I think it's been a really good model. I mean, I've been very closely involved with it. It does go towards security. And we're seeing a lot of the regulational things not focus on security, but rather focus on privacy. And there are some distinctions there. And really largely from my perspective, it means the regulations are not prescriptive, like here's how you have to do it. They say, oh, if you don't get it right, then here are the fines. So the regulations seem to be more focused on when things go bad. Here's the stick. And we see, I think, from the Security Council, hey, here are the standards, not too prescriptive, but have to be somewhat prescriptive. And here are the ways that we would recognize as state of the art, and that's constantly changing. And so they have sort of the standard. The government regulators have sort of the stick, and then you have the brands card brands may be providing incentives, providing the carrots, saying, hey, by the way, if you do these things, not only will it help with privacy and security, but it's going to lower your costs, maybe the fees that you pay or the fines that you pay or different things like this. So I think right now it is working. Our challenge is to figure out how to grow this model and these technologies outside of payments. We are in healthcare. Just give you a quick example there. I've been in front of, a few in my time, but it's interesting to hear, the CISO say, gosh, you guys fixed 100% of 10% of my problem. Because the other 90% of my problem is PII and PHI and all this other data that's very scary if it gets out into the wild. And it's not like this credit card that can be, renumbered. You can't really renumber someone's biometric or their healthcare data. There's very sensitive stuff there. So the goal here, and that's what we've been charged with these last 2 years, is extending that outside of payments.
Ben, what do you think?
I was kind of sad as, an American exceptionalist, thinking we're the greatest country on earth, that it took us a long time to catch up with our European rivals when it came to payment security.
Yes.
So, it's just interesting how that's happened and how it's evolved. And I think what strikes me is we're still sort of behind in making sure that these payments are secure. And that's dangerous. I mean, a lot of what happens in terms of rectifying these problems happens after there has already been a security incident, meaning somebody's already used our credit card somewhere and we can cancel that payment and work with our financial institution. But yeah, I mean, it's a little concerning that we haven't caught up with the rest of the world in terms of the most robust security measures.
Yeah, absolutely. Still scratch my head that, go out to a restaurant, give a stranger your credit card, they take it to another room to process it. Our European friends seem to have this much better figured out. They bring a little portable device out to the table, and it all gets done right there. It seems to me in these days that's a much more secure way to handle it.
Sure, and having two factors of authentication. So chip and PIN, great. The PIN is the chip is the fancy computer thing. The PIN is the content of your own mind. Meld those two together, it's like chocolate and peanut butter. It's a beautiful Reese's. Just having the chip is kind of just the peanut butter. You need that chocolate to make it extra secure, extra delicious. And, without having that second factor, we are making ourselves more vulnerable because anybody could just steal a chip card and put it into a machine, charge it, get whatever you're trying to purchase. So, I mean, it's certainly striking.
Now I want a snack. All right. Well, our thanks to Rustin Miles from Bluefin for joining us. We do appreciate him taking the time to share his expertise. And we want to thank our sponsors, KnowBe4. They are the social engineering experts and the pioneers of new school security awareness training. Be sure to take advantage of their free phishing test, which you can find at knowbe4.com/fishtest. Think of KnowBe4 for your security training. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. The Caveat podcast is proudly produced in Maryland at the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Our senior producer is Jennifer Iben. Our executive editor is Peter Kilpie. I'm Dave Bittner.
And I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.